Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, July 22nd. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, government spends a lot of time measuring compliance, but does accountability actually help programs succeed? Plus, if accountability depends on honest assessments of performance, are agencies using the tools Congress gave them to make those assessments? Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. More than a year after a government-wide return-to-office mandate, federal employees are reporting lower productivity, diminished morale, and increasing strains on their work-life balance. A recent survey conducted by Federal News Network finds that many feds are experiencing distracting workspaces, long commutes, and inadequate resources. Here with more on the latest survey results is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Nice to be with you, Terry.
Tell us about the survey's findings on productivity of federal employees. That really stands out.
Absolutely. The productivity findings were really significant in this. And I will just point out at the top as well that we received a huge number of survey responses from employees. Almost 7,500 people filled out the survey. So that was one of the top line findings, was reports of decreased productivity. This was very common among our survey respondents. We found that more than 3/4, or about 76%, are either somewhat or much less productive now than they were prior to returning to the office. About 21% said they have the same level of productivity at work between before and after working in the office, and just 3% said that they are now more productive working in the office versus teleworking. So one survey respondent, for example, said that they're less able to focus, less able to get the resources that they need to perform their job duties now versus pre-returning to the office.
This is all driven by the Trump administration's early guidance on bringing everybody back. Just refresh our memory on what the particulars of that were.
This all ties back to a day one executive order from President Trump. He told agencies to end federal employees' telework and remote work agreements consistent with applicable law. That's led to, in some instances, to reasonable accommodations issues between agencies and federal unions. But if we look at the big picture, what this has meant is that telework and remote work hours have decreased significantly across the federal workforce. Data from the Office of Personnel Management shows a more than 75% decrease in telework and remote work hours between January and October of 2025. Trump administration officials have said it's meant to boost productivity, boost collaboration, to have everyone in the office together. But the survey findings that we have from just recently, earlier this year, show that a lot of federal employees are pushing back against that sentiment and saying that actually returning to the office has accomplished the opposite of those stated goals.
And when they brought everybody back last year, there were a lot of concerns about the physical workspace and crowding and access. How are folks feeling about that a year in?
It really depends on the individual situation. In some cases, those earlier issues have subsided. As a refresher, in the first few months of returning to the office, some federal employees were saying that they were working in conference rooms, hallways, even storage closets, as their agencies kind of scrambled to get everyone back in person as quickly as possible. But now those early issues seem to have subsided to some extent, and not for everyone. But generally, there are still a lot of concerns about the physical workspace. About 57% of our survey respondents were dissatisfied with their physical workspace and environment, and just a quarter said that they were satisfied or very satisfied. A lot of people said that they are having trouble focusing because there's a lot of distractions and they're still in open workspaces and work settings. Some said that they feel like there's not really a point in going to the office because they're just joining virtual meetings anyway, and they're not actually working next to their team members. So I would say, even though some of those early issues have subsided, there's still concerns about that. There's also discussion in the survey results about just outdated facilities, slow internet connections, other difficulties with equipment, etc. So just a lot of issues that are still going on even now.
And maybe not a surprise in the greater Washington, D.C. area, but the commute really seemed to be a big issue for folks in their responses. What did they have to say about it?
Absolutely. The commute was definitely a top concern from survey respondents as well. This is something that we've seen consistently across the different surveys that we've done of our audiences, that the commute is one of the top reasons that people don't like going into the office every day. They talked in this survey about high costs of fuel, traffic congestion, long stretches of time that's spent either on public transportation or just sitting on the road. And beyond just the actual time spent on the commute, a lot of respondents talked about how that's cutting into their work-life balance, saying that hours that they might have spent otherwise working from home and actually putting in extra work towards their jobs is now spent on the road, or they're too exhausted when they get home to do much else. The respondents also talked about their productivity declining as a result of the commute as well, because, again, they're just either stressed from sitting in traffic, they're exhausted from spending so many hours on the road. So just, a lot of concerns there, and continuing concerns about what the commute is really looking like for these employees. The actual time spent on the road is a little bit different. Some people said they do live close to the office, but others said they're spending 3, 4, 5 hours a day commuting.
The survey did ask, what would most improve federal employees' work experience right now? What did they say?
This was a really interesting question, Terry, because what we did was have a list of options of asking federal employees what would make your in-office experience better, and respondents could select multiple options here. But the number one selected option by far was a call for more flexible schedules and also simply fewer days spent in the office. So there's this real push towards a hybrid work model. That's what we had prior to this Trump administration, and it seemed to work well from a lot of federal employees' perspectives. Then below that, you had a lot of people say that an easier commute would improve their experience. For example, if they lived closer to the office. Some also talked about the better team collaboration efforts. So as I mentioned earlier, people having concerns that there's no real reason to be in the office. So they said if there is a real purpose for in-person collaboration and coordination between teams, then that they would feel like maybe at least there's some reason that they are there in the office instead of just sitting on their computers all day.
And Drew, where will this information go? Do you think that decision makers in the Trump administration are going to take it on?
I would say that's not very likely. They seem to be drawing a very hard line here about returning to the office. I think that's been very clear in the way that they've a lot of agencies are handling reasonable accommodations requests and looking for other ways to maybe try to work with employees rather than approving any telework requests, even if employees have medical conditions or disabilities that they're asking to be able to telework for that reason. So I don't imagine that these survey results are going to necessarily change the Trump administration's mind, but it is a solid data point to show that a lot of federal employees, at least that responded to this survey, are really feeling down with morale, down with productivity after returning to the office last year.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for sharing this information with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You can find more on the survey results at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, government spends a lot of time measuring compliance, but does accountability actually help programs succeed? This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. When people hear the word accountability, they often think about assigning blame after something goes wrong. But my next guest says accountability starts much earlier. It begins with creating the conditions for success. Joining me now is Dr. Abraham Wandersman, Senior Scientist at the Wandersman Center at Forsmarsh. Dr. Wandersman, it's lovely to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
You have written that accountability is more than compliance or reporting after the fact. What is missing from the way most organizations define accountability today?
So it's very common to think about accountability as who's to blame for this big mistake? Who's to blame for this fiasco? You know, if you pick up the newspaper, there's often a lot of that kind of accountability. We would like to see an accountability that helps us move forward. And so the way we think about accountability can be how to be strategic and results-oriented with limited time, energy, and money, which always seems to be the case. So how can we think about accountability prospectively? How can we use that kind of thinking to help us get better outcomes? And what we've done is we ask and answer 10 accountability questions. First one is, why are you doing what you're doing? How do you know it's really needed? That's the first question. The second is, given those needs, what are you trying to achieve and with whom? How will you know you've had a successful outcome? That's followed with, all right, how are we going to reach those outcomes? And we have 3 questions and steps when they're answered that help us reach those outcomes. Question number 3 is, are there best practices? Are there things that have been shown to work that will help us get those outcomes that we have set for ourselves? And we know that not every place is the same. So question 4 is, well, that might be a good practice and it may have worked in California. Will it work in rural South Carolina? So question 4 is about fit. You can think about a best practice and see whether it would fit in another place or whether you have to make adaptations. The 5th question is capacity. So this thing may have worked when we had a lot of money and maybe a state had a lot of money. Let's say it was California. And you come to a place in, let's say, a rural county in South Carolina, they don't have the same capacities. They may not have the same capacity to do that thing. So in order to be accountable, you have to have sufficient capacity to do that practice. Once you've decided what you're going to do, step 6 comes up. And question 6 is, what's the plan? Who's going to do what, when, where, and how? Step 7 is, all right, you have this great plan. It looked good on paper. What actually happened when you implemented it? And then step 8 is, and question 8 is, well, did you get the outcomes? You went through all that work of steps 1 through 7. Now it's time to say, well, did we achieve what we wanted to achieve? And then there are 2 more accountability questions. We don't end there. Maybe we got some of the outcomes we wanted, but not all of them. How do we fix that? How do we go back and say, let's add a best practice? Let's do something in addition that helps us get the outcomes we want. And last but not least is sustainability. We spent all that time, energy, and money. We don't want it to disappear if it actually worked. So if you ask those questions looking forward, they help us be strategic and results-oriented with our limited time, energy, and money. You can also use those 10 questions to retrospectively look at a success or look at a failure.
So as you walk through those 10 questions, it's pretty clear that you would advocate that leaders who are about to embark on some kind of program really think through the process. The government has a process of providing notice of funding opportunities. How would you apply that framework so that leaders can think about what they're trying to do before they actually commit funding to it?
I love that question because funders help the world go around. They have so much influence. We actually did a version of this with the city of Philadelphia, had $2 billion to spend on behavioral health services. And they give out contracts every year to organizations in Philadelphia, for example. And before they put out some new contracts, they turn those questions on themselves. They wanted to be accountable in what they were asking for in their notice of funding opportunity. So they did a real deep dive into thinking about that funding opportunity, and then they could be more proactive and try to get a better contract for services from the organizations that would be bidding on that contract. It's a beautiful example, I think, about how both the funder and the organizations that want to get funding can be more accountable, can be more results oriented, and can get better outcomes.
Dr. Abraham Wandersman is the senior scientist of the Wandersman Center at Forres Marsh. Dr. Wandersman, Congress has passed numerous laws requiring federal agencies to report on performance. How do you connect performance and accountability, and does that legislative structure give federal agencies a good accountability framework?
Thanks for that question. So back at the end of the last century, the Government Performance and Results Act was passed, and it was a move in that direction. However, at least the GPRA indicators that are asked for are often activities. And activities are not the same as outcomes. How many people did you reach is not the same as whether those people you reached actually are better off. And so the GPRA indicators are a start, at least the ones I'm familiar with, in that direction, but don't go fully to outcomes. And so I would love to see more happen with the actual outcomes and move the GPRA indicators to have more of an outcome orientation.
That's been a perpetual problem for folks who want to measure government performance. We have a structure set up to measure inputs, typically resources, and outputs, also typically resources, but not one in place to really measure outcomes. What do you think we would need to put in place to actually be able to measure those outcomes?
Well, I think that's where the thoughtfulness comes in on the part of the funder, on the part of the government agency that's going to put out a notice of funding opportunity, and that they think about both in step two, that second question of what do we want to achieve, what outcomes do we want to achieve. They're being very specific about that. And then question 8 was, what did you actually achieve? That's the actual outcomes. So they can help by thinking about what would be the important, realistically ambitious outcomes to be achieved with the amount of money that they're willing to put into that initiative. And I'd love to see that happen. And the reason I've spent my career of decades on trying to figure out how to get to outcomes is because I care so much that a lot of money actually is spent. And we could be getting more out of our money if we were more strategic and results oriented, both on the funder side and on the recipient of those fund sides.
The framework of accountability, in my mind, often has an accountability to whom? Who are you accountable to? And when we think about federal agencies, and you talked about funders, is that who federal agencies should be accountable to, the Congress who has the power of the purse? Or is there another two out there that you'd advocate for?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, Congress would be one. Congress should be considering what the public thinks are important outcomes. I mean, that comes up all the time where we're not where we want to be with reading scores, or we're not where we want to be with disease, cancer treatment or cancer prevention. So the Congress's concerns for outcomes should usually be almost synonymous, if not synonymous, with the public's concerns. What does the public care about? Where do we want to be? And so those really should be more or less the same.
And let's pull it from a macro down to a micro level, because you've worked with organizations for decades around this accountability issue. When you see leaders, regardless of the kind of agency, who are continually and consistently delivering results, what do they understand and do differently when it comes to accountability?
Well, there are so many. There are so many reasons why we don't get outcomes. Sometimes the capacities are not fully there. There could be turnover issues. There could be motivational issues. So leaders who are strategic will have a process and have what we call the general capacities to move things forward. They have sufficient staff. The staff is sufficiently trained. They understand the priorities and why this is a priority to get this to actually happen. And then they support that happening with the resources necessary. They don't just ask people to jump so high, but they give them the proper support to do that. And actually, one of the areas we work on a lot is the science and practice of implementation support. Putting out a NOFO or a great idea is one thing. Getting it to actually happen is another. And that's going to be the topic of a CDC day we're having in August, where we're going to be doing a science seminar on how to go from notice of funding opportunities to outcomes, and the importance of building capacity to do that, the importance of thinking through a process that can help you get there.
Dr. Abraham Wandersman is the senior scientist of the Wandersman Center at Forest Marsh. Thank you so much for sharing this with us today.
You're very welcome. Glad to do it. Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, federal agencies measure everything from staffing levels to performance goals. But those metrics don't always tell leaders whether they actually have the capacity to accomplish their mission. But first, if accountability depends on an honest assessment of performance, are agencies using the tools Congress gave them to make those assessments? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Knowing whether a program is succeeding requires more than good intentions. It requires a disciplined look at results. Congress strengthened federal performance management requirements in 2024, but a new GAO review finds important pieces still haven't been fully implemented. Here to explain what GAO found is Lori Atkinson, Acting Director for Strategic Issues at GAO. Lori, it is great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, thank you for inviting me today.
We're going to talk about government agency performance. Congress created a new requirement for performance management in 2024, the Federal Agency Performance Act. Before we jump into what GAO found as you looked at this, how does this fit in with the other sorts of performance legislation like GIPRA and GIPRAMA?
So this new legislation was an attempt to modernize the current performance management for the federal government. It did things like it required OMB to establish cross-cutting goals within the first year of an administration. It also codified the requirement for agencies to conduct annual strategic reviews to assess whether programs are achieving or contributing to agency goals.
And that topic of strategic review comes up quite a bit in this report. When you're looking at that, what are you actually looking for agencies to do? And why do you think it's such an important management tool?
So strategic reviews sometimes sounds like a bureaucratic paper exercise, but strategic reviews are really meant to be decision-making tools. And so what we were looking for in this particular review was we were looking at the guidance that OMB had established for the strategic reviews. We were looking to see, how much of the guidance had been provided to agencies. So if you think of OMB as like a central steering committee, creating a blueprint for agencies, other federal agencies to conduct these strategic reviews, the guidance that OMB provided should help build the structure that the agencies are doing for their strategic reviews, what's to be included, what they should be considering as part of the reviews. But what we found was that OMB had omitted part of the guidance. So the blueprint that went out to the agencies to build the strategic reviews, we're missing a couple of the requirements from the law. And so that's where some of our recommendations were around updating the guidance to include all the aspects of the law.
OMB has been doing annual reviews with the agencies for a few years. What are the new requirements in this law and what was missing from the guidance?
So what was missing from the guidance was really from OMB's perspective were like 4 different aspects, and a lot of it was around leadership involvement, and that was missing. Also, stakeholder engagement, documentation standards, and then the fourth thing that OMB guidance was missing was how agencies should assess risk and the evidence for as part of the strategic reviews. So all of this, when you're missing pieces of it can result in the strategic reviews not being as robust and not helping the agencies accomplish really what the strategic reviews are intended to do, which is, to make those for leadership to have the information they need to make decisions. What's working well, what's not working well, needs to be adjusted, perhaps.
Does the law require that OMB follow up on this to get the feedback from agency strategic reviews?
So we looked at 4 agencies as part of our review: DHS, Treasury, State, and GSA. And we found that they had not fully implemented the law as well. And they were missing, in some cases, for example, DHS and Treasury were missing parts of the guidance as well. But in the case of State and GSA, they had not done any of the guidance, and they were missing large pieces of it. So when we talked with the agencies, they did confirm that they really rely on OMB's guidance for creating their own. And so what happens when, they're missing the guidance, they run the risk of the strategic reviews don't provide the opportunity that they're intended to do. They don't, allow for full implementation of the law because, they're missing big pieces of the guidance.
Lori Atkinson is Acting Director, Strategic Issues at GAO. So, Lori, those are 4 big agencies. They all have pretty significant agency overhead and strategic planning shops. They should know how to do this. Is there something else they're doing that could be co-opted into this strategic review? Are they getting close in other ways?
DHS, Treasury, and GSA all conducted strategic reviews in 2025, but you may have noted that State did not do a strategic review in 2025, and so that was our recommendation, was that they do a strategic review in 2026, and so we are State agreed that they would be doing that review. So they are doing, the agencies that we looked at either have done the reviews or have plans to do the 2026 reviews, which is important because without those reviews, they're really missing opportunities to improve how government's working for the taxpayer.
And one of the things that really stood out to me was the emphasis here on bringing in people beyond the immediate program offices. You want to bring in data officers and evaluation officials and even some outside stakeholders. Why is that broader participation so important to getting these strategic reviews right and to really getting a feel for agency performance?
So when you think of a strategic review as being more than a paperwork exercise and really providing key information on how the agency's performing and how effective the agency is in achieving its goals, it's important that the leadership is involved and you have leadership perspective. And also key to that are stakeholders, because you may be missing, without their involvement, you could be missing key information that can really inform the effectiveness of the strategic reviews in helping to address some of the biggest problems the government face, which are, big cross-cutting issues, cross-agency issues that have been longstanding in some cases, like cybersecurity.
That cross-cutting issue really is the theme here, trying to figure out how agencies talk to each other and really move forward on these complicated issues. If you're going to bring stakeholders into that, how do you reach out and bring them in? Did you see any of these agencies do that well?
So cross-cutting agency issues it's been a longstanding problem. GAO has reported on this topic for several years, and it's a theme also in our duplication, overlap, and fragmentation reports that we produce annually. And so there have been some efforts to address some of these issues, but they still remain a challenge for the federal government, and it is because multiple stakeholders are involved in that collaboration aspect.
There are 7 recommendations in the report. If you rank ordered them maybe top to bottom, what are the most important things that you'd like to see some progress on to really improve this strategic review process?
So, we think all the recommendations are important and need to be implemented. But of course, starting at the top with OMB and providing the fulsome guidance to address all the requirements in the law would be where I would say we would want to first start. Because as I mentioned earlier, if you think about OMB as like a central steering committee and providing a blueprint to the rest of the federal government, you want to make sure that blueprint's complete. And so, that would be where we would want to see the initial stages. We also think it's important for the State Department to do a strategic review in 2026. Going 2 years without a review would be like flying blind without having the information that's key to how the agency is performing. And then, of course, we want to see the other agencies we looked at update their guidance as well.
And then if we get these all together, if we start doing the strategic reviews according to the law and agencies are really engaged in this, what would you expect to look different in the future?
Well, what we hope is that, when the strategic reviews are a leadership priority and they are taken as more than just a paperwork exercise, we hope that they are opportunities to help improve how government's working for taxpayers. Our recommendations are really intended to help the agencies fully implement the law as it was intended. And, by doing that, strengthening performance management can help effectively manage these big, complex challenges that are cross-agency that the government's facing, like cybersecurity, disaster relief, and other challenges.
Lori Atkinson is Acting Director, Strategic Issues at GAO. Thanks so much for joining me today and walking us through this report.
Thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, federal agencies measure everything from staffing levels to performance goals. But those metrics don't always tell leaders whether they actually have the capacity to accomplish their mission. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Agencies collect enormous amounts of information about performance, but those measures don't always answer a fundamental management question, which is, does the organization have the capability to accomplish its mission? My next guest believes federal leaders need a better way to assess readiness. Joining me is John Mullins, founder of Mullins Consulting. John, thanks so much for joining me on the show today. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Terry. Looking forward to it.
You've recently published a new management tool, the Operational Readiness and Resiliency Index, or ORRI. My read of it says it kind of starts with the idea that government leaders don't have a good way to assess whether they have the talent and the capabilities they need to achieve their mission objectives. As you started to think about this, what do you think is missing from the tools they have today?
Well, that's an interesting question, Terry. I think historically what we've done in planning is we've looked at goals and objectives, and we looked at budget and FTE and ceilings, and not necessarily looking at capabilities, capacity against targeted performance goals. So this is a new way of looking at your organization in terms of talent, and we use the expression talent regardless of source. Now, going back to this, and I think we had previous conversation in the past where I told you that ORRI really is the outgrowth of a tool that we developed from the Management Advisory Group in support of a larger concept called New Federalism 2.0. And 2.0 is essentially a domestic equivalent of Goldwater Nichols to look at government performance domestically organized around regional organizations rather than functional organizations. Once we realized that, we also need a different way of thinking about resourcing. So ORI, think of it best as kind of a financial investment index. where you look at talent in terms of three groups: human talent, technological talent, and leverage talent. So we want people to start thinking differently about the tools they have within a larger ecosystem around program delivery.
You mention ORRI in the writings as the domestic equivalent of military readiness. So walk us through that comparison. What does it mean in practice?
Well, ORI, think of it as, first of all, I said an index, but if you look at it holistically, it's looking at organizations in terms of its health, its culture, and its performance. So it's not just looking at talent and your workforce in terms of what it's assigned to do, but what it can do. Years ago, I remember I had a conversation with Pat Tamburino. You probably remember Pat. I was in his office and on the E-ring, and he says, "Mullins, why are you here?" I said, "Well, I'm here to talk to you a little bit about personnel and readiness." He says, "I have all these people here who work for me. What can you tell me that they can't?" I said, "That's a fair question." I said, "I can tell you what your workforce can do, not what they're assigned to do. And that can make the difference between success or failure." And why do I say that? Because historically, data systems and personnel systems are measuring talent in terms of assigned work, not in terms of the capabilities of the workforce. Secondly, we also talk about, for example, when I was meeting with Scott Cooper at OPM, with FEVS. FEVS is a tool that looks historically backwards once a year. You need to know about your organization's health today, not 6 months ago. And you need it in terms of objective performance, not emotional performance. So ORI is looking at things holistically in terms of talent, performance, culture, and health. And that is the equivalent of the Defense Readiness Index for us. Yeah.
When you talk about talent, you mentioned onboard talent, technological talent, and leveraged talent. You're including contractors in that sort of total workforce. How do you get a handle on capacity and capability?
Let's go back one step. Some time ago, our team was briefing Karen Evans while she was still at FEMA. Now, if you look at FEMA, FEMA has their essential, they have their core, they have their expansion, but they don't get their work done necessarily with feds alone, and they don't do it just with contractors. They do it in partnership with state, local governments, NGOs, etc. That's what we call the larger ecosystem of talent. If you were looking at Amazon today, they have a lot of investments in robotics, AI applications. They also have their contractor workforce, they have their current workforce. If you look at the federal government today, what's those allocations look like? How much is federal employment? How much is technological employment? How much is leveraged? And do you have the right allocations today as well? What will that allocation look like tomorrow? For FEMA, it looks at the ecosystem of program delivery because it's concentrating on performance. You have to leverage all those assets. You remember your time with NAPA and talking about enterprise risk management. Essentially, that has always been a budget exercise, but really it's a skill exercise as well. And so this is dealing with looking at things holistically and looking at things in terms of relationships around performance.
John Mullins is the founder of Mullins Consulting. John, I don't disagree with you conceptually. I am right there with you. My question, though, is for leaders in government today, how do they measure those kinds of factors to get that holistic assessment? Because one of the things we hear all the time is we don't have a way to measure outcomes and we don't have a way to measure capability. How does ORRI help them today actually measure that?
Well, when I get that question, I always say you already have all the information, at least 95% of it. You already have it. It's not in a single data set. When we break down the index, we actually have an exercise where we break down the index and we say, what is the data set? Because remember what I said, it has to be objective truth. So many times federal agencies have aspirational goals, but they don't have quantifiable goals. It's hard to measure aspirations. But when you start talking about things quantifiably, then you do have a measure. We have more capabilities today than we've ever had before in terms of measuring workforce, productivity, cycle time. We also have international benchmarks that we can compare and contrast around performance. We also have data systems. For example, every one of on the health, we break things down. We give our clients suggested performance measures, and we tell them what the data source is. For almost all these aspects, there is a registered, objective, authoritative source of information to put these things. But you have to, no function owns it all. You have to get finance data from the finance people. You get personnel from the personnel data. You get these tracking systems from other systems, and you bring them together. And by the way, as Mark Foreman would say on our team, you're going to have to use some additional graph technologies to build up the relationships and the correlations. So some of it is objective, some of it is correlated, but the combinations is very powerful.
And so is this something that is done by the HR team? Is it something that's done by a project manager? Is it something that's done by an agency head? Whose responsibility is it to pull all of that together?
Well, in my old days working in government, I would say it was the chief management officer, because that they have the functional responsibilities for bringing it all together. That perhaps is one of the most difficult hurdles to overcome, is who has the authority to bring this together, and that's a legitimate question. But quite honestly, as I've spoken with some of the agency heads, they say, who are new to government, they say, don't we do this already? And the answer is, of course, we don't. But we should and we must. But I recall, for those of us who've also worked in the private sector, we do measure this way. We measure capabilities, we measure capacity, we measure return on investment, we look at risk, and we build that into our calculations when we bid on work. So this is not a new concept or phenomenon for many of us in the private sector, but government increasingly needs to look at these things in terms of new eyes. This is a new way of approaching it. And by the way, you'll notice on the performance side, as I used to tease Robert Shea, is we've had PART. Remember PART, this performance assessment rating tool? We had category management. We haven't gotten rid of category management. Category management looks at a lot of these things. GIPRA looks at a lot of these things. And increasingly, we need to start re-examining what we've already thrown away and bring some of the stuff back, because we had it. If we had the technology we had today, PART would have been a much more viable tool.
So, John, PART and GIPRA, important tools, sort of also have a history of becoming just one more report card as opposed to a real live management tool. How would you keep ORRI from falling into the same pattern?
Well, I always say if performance matters, it's not an unnecessary tool. If performance is a report card, it's just a waste of time. So this is how you need to manage. And this is how you operate. This is how you think through things. For example, if you had an ORI index, you'd be able to do comparative performance regarding about if I have an extra $2.5 million to invest this year, who do I give it to? Who has the highest cycle time? Who has the lowest cycle time? Who has the highest return on investment? Who are the people who are currently configured and capable of doing this? Frequently, we go out and say, I need these new skill sets, and I don't know who has them, because the personnel system doesn't tell you what people can do. They just tell you what they're assigned to do. We need a different way of looking at things. By the way, you and I remember David Walker, right, at GAO. This would not be a foreign concept to David, because remember what he did to his personnel system. He based it on a skills-based capability and utilization and performance. Again, for everything in ORI, there is a historical precedent where we've actually done some of this. This is just bringing it all together. There's nothing magical about ORI other than the fact that we're now saying, let's put it together because we've done parts of this all over already.
And so if we've piqued a listener's interest out there and they want to know more about this model and the sources of data for it, where can they find out more information?
Well, please write to me. I'm on LinkedIn. And again, the Management Advisory Group it's larger than me. It's Mark Foreman, it's Stephen Gavin, it's Casey Coleman. The four of us put this thing together. And we'd be happy to share more of this with you. And there's much deeper publications and information regarding the matrix and how to get the data.
I've been speaking with John Mullins. He's the founder of Mullins Consulting. John, thanks so much for sharing this new idea with us.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Have a good day.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. General Dynamics Information Technology is challenging the Defense Information Systems Agency's decision to expand Leidos's $11 billion Defense Enclave Services contract to include the combatant commands. The company argues that the agency should have competed the new work. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more details. Anastasia, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Terry.
What is at the center of this bid protest?
Yeah, so in 2022, DISA awards this massive Defense Enclave Services contract to Leidos. The goal of the contract is to transition 22 Fourth Estate defense agencies and field activities onto the single standardized secure network managed by DISA. In May, there was a memo from the DoD CIO office, and they're basically telling DISA to transition all combatant commands' common use IT services to this Defense Department network by the end of fiscal 2028. And then shortly after, DISA comes out and says, we're going to expand the scope of the enclave contract and add combatant commands to it to do the work. They issue this justification for the non-competitive contract notification document, and they basically are saying that the enclave contract is the only viable contracting alternative, given these very short timelines for migrating combatant commands to DoD by the end of fiscal 2028. And then GDIT comes out and files a protest bid with the Government Accountability Office saying that this is outside of the scope of the contract and that DISA should have competed it. DISA should have competed the requirement to migrate combatant commands instead of just giving this work to Leidos.
And why didn't DISA actually put this up for competition?
So they kind of lay out a couple of reasons in this justification document. First, they say that Leidos is, and I quote, uniquely qualified to execute this migration because of the company's institutional, embedded, and specialized knowledge of the DoD architecture. And we will talk a little bit about it later. They're saying that the DoD is extremely complex. A new vendor would face, and I quote, an unacceptably steep learning curve. They're saying that it would introduce high risks of operational disruption. It would introduce further schedule slips, as they would require ramp-up time to onboard technical subject matter experts and to gain the understanding of the complexities of the DoD environment. They're saying that the learning curve would significantly delay network migration beyond 2028, and they're basically saying that that would jeopardize combatant commands modernization efforts. And they're also saying that if they competed, a new competition would result in a substantial duplication in administrative and technical cost. So those are their reasons.
And as GDIT brings the protest, what parts of that are they arguing against?
So GDIT actually didn't provide a comment for the story, but I spoke to a source who's familiar with the situation, and they brought up a couple of points. So the first one is that DISA didn't really consider other contracting pathways that are available to them that could have achieved the CIO's objectives. For instance, DISA could have considered existing enterprise contract vehicles that already support combatant commands in their IT operations, and those alternatives could have offered faster, less costly, and more effective alternatives. Then they're saying that DISA is using, and it's in the justification document, DISA is saying that Leidos has migrated about 40,000 users to DoD, and they're using that as evidence to justify that the contractor can do this job and they're qualified to do the work. But at the same time, the original solicitations required the vendor to support the migration and sustainment of at least 370,000 users. So then DISA also makes a point of saying that Leidos has this institutional deep knowledge of the DoD environment that no one else has. But what the source is telling me is that every combatant command is different. They operate in unique environments. They're geographically different, etc. And that makes this particular migration effort a lot more complex, a lot more different in comparison to migrating like kind of back office administrative functions, which is what the enclave contract is focused on. And migrating combatant commands environments, the dependencies to the critical mission systems is so complex, and understanding those environments is probably a lot more important than just understanding the DoD environment. So those are just some of the kind of counter arguments that I'm hearing.
Didn't DISA lose a protest for a similar attempt to add out-of-scope work to the enclave contract in the past?
Yes, they actually did. There was one company that successfully challenged DISA's attempt to move National Defense University's IT work to Leidos under the Enclave contract. So lots of similarities here. That company similarly argued that National Defense University's requirements are outside of the scope of this Enclave contract. And they also made an argument that it was an unlawful and inadequately justified sole source award to Leidos. GAO subsequently finds that the challenge to the sole source action was clearly meritorious. They're saying that the evidence that DISA provided was insufficient to justify a sole source task order to Leidos, and that the evidence is insufficient that no other contractor could satisfy the agency's requirements. So yeah, DISA has tried adding this kind of out of scope work to the Enclave contract in the past, and they did not succeed. So we'll see what happens this time.
Well, what is next for this particular protest?
Yeah, so the GAO is supposed to issue a ruling by October 19th. So we will be watching that. They will determine whether DISA's move to expand the contract without competition stands or it requires reconsideration. But at the same time, procurement professionals should be watching this dispute over sole source expansion and what the implications are. For contractors, this case could be important because of the future opportunities, of course, related to this migration, but then also that urgency doesn't automatically override procurement regulations.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, thanks for bringing us the story.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find the full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Santaford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. As agencies look to stay connected anywhere and everywhere, satellite technologies are becoming a critical part of the mission toolkit. Join Federal News Network today through Thursday for our Space and Satellite Exchange and a first-hand look at the future of federal connectivity. Register now at federalnewsnetwork.com. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.